Hello, I'm Brian Garner, and we're here at Southern Methodist University at the DeGolyer Library. And this is an exhibition called Taming the Tongue. Here's the book that accompanies the exhibition, Taming the Tongue, published by the Grolier Club in New York City. The original exhibition was in the Grolier Club. This is the fifth and I think probably the best incarnation of Taming the Tongue, beautifully displayed by Russell Martin III, the director and chief librarian at the DeGolyer. We're talking about the heyday of English grammar from 1711 to 1851. Now, why would that be a heyday? Well, there were so many grammars published in that era, and there was a great deal of competition among grammarians. And grammars, believe it or not, were some of the best-selling books because every household in the English-speaking world had to have a grammar, a dictionary, and a Bible. The world has changed radically since those days, but there was a lot of competition. There was great plagiarism and fury and even scandal in the field of grammar as all these grammarians were jockeying for position. Now we're going to cover the highlights today, 70 of my 1900 grammars. I'm sort of a grammar fanatic. I'm a grammarian myself and a lexicographer, so I write books on grammar and dictionaries. But this is not about my writing. This is about the era from 1711 to 1851 and the fascinating things that happened in the field of grammar during that period. You might wonder what would lead somebody to collect 1900 grammars. Well, I think the answer, probably the origins of it, lay in an event that occurred in my high school. When I was a sophomore in high school in the panhandle of Texas, in a little town called Canyon, we had a class called English Grammar, and the teacher said, "Who can name the parts of speech?" I raised my hand, he called on me, and I said, "Nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, pronouns, conjunctions, interjections, and articles. There are 9. And he said, "No, you're wrong." He didn't even say, "Good job, good try," or anything like that. He said, "You're wrong. There are only 8, and articles are not a part of speech." Well, that set me on an odyssey to find out what is the truth about how many parts of speech there are. And in fact, we don't know. Grammarians can't agree. The numbers have ranged from 3 all the way up to 33. Some of the leading grammarians today say that there are 17. Another one, though, says there are 21. I go with the traditional 8. So yes, I ended up coming around to the point of view of my English teacher back in high school, reluctantly, I must say. Let's have a look. We're going to see the grammarian who says that there are 33 parts of speech, and we're going to see the grammarian who says that there are only 3 parts of speech. That's also been carried into even modern grammars. But let's begin back at the beginning of this era, 1711, with the first case. At the beginning of the 18th century, English grammar simply wasn't studied. It wasn't part of school curricula. Instead, it was Latin grammar. And so we begin with a 1714 grammar, William Lilly's short introduction of grammar. And it's right here. It was published in Oxford at the Sheldonian Theatre. William Lilly first published this in 1513, and it was a mainstay in English education for several centuries. Then we move to the first English grammar of the period that we're talking about. It's by John Brightland and Charles Gildon. It is thought to be primarily by Gildon, who was kind of a Grub Street hack. Interestingly, they publicized this book with a false blurb by Isaac Bickerstaff, who was really Jonathan Swift. It was Jonathan Swift's pen name. They quote Bickerstaff as saying, "Buy, read, and study this grammar." By 1714, it was already in a 3rd edition. And then third, we have what I think is one of the most fascinating books. It's a grammar of the English Saxon tongue. It's really a grammar of Old English by Elizabeth Elstob. She was a remarkable woman. She was raised by her uncle because her parents died when she was young. And she was raised by an uncle who opposed female education. Yet she became very learned. She learned several languages and ended up writing the very first grammar of Old English, Elizabeth Elstob. This is 1715. She is also the first grammarian for whom we have a likeness. And this is the likeness of her that appears on the title page. In this second case, we begin with James Greenwood, an essay towards a practical English grammar. He actually published this around 1711, 1712. My earliest edition is 1722. It's the first edition. When this volume was published, Greenwood was the second master at St. Paul's School, London. Isaac Watts said that Greenwood showed deep knowledge, but there were vituperative critics as well. Charles Gildon, we just saw his grammar a moment ago with Brightland, charged Greenwood with making the task of learning grammar more difficult. Andrea Guarna called it the worst grammar of the English tongue that I ever saw. And yet, Greenwood's grammar was more popular than the others and went through several editions. Then we have John Henley. Henley was a fascinating character. We have no likeness of Greenwood or Henley. A scholarly poseur, Henley struggled as a student at Cambridge, where he said that he had the stupidity to be educated. He supposedly bested 10 examiners and was thanked by the university. Those are his words. Henley's original plan, he claimed, had been to publish a grammar for each major language at the rate of one per month, if you can believe it. His plan was derailed by, quote, delays of the press, end quote. As for errors in the book, Henley tried to deflect criticism by saying that even a moderate scholar will discern and detect them. Then we have Dyche and Pardon. Dyche was predominantly a lexicographer. Although he's predominantly known as a lexicographer, this dictionary was not published until after his death, so it's posthumous. And this was the first English dictionary to include a grammar in the front matter. That became a tradition throughout the 18th century, to put a grammar at the beginning of a dictionary. Even Samuel Johnson, as we'll see in 1755, did that. First published after Dyche's death in 1727, 8 years later. So it was published in 1735. This book was one of the more important pre-Johnson English dictionaries. The compendious grammar consists of 10 pages at the front, an early instance of prefacing a dictionary with a grammar. Dyche and Pardon wrote, quote, "The vulgar error among the generality of people is that young persons are necessitated to learn the Latin or Lilly's grammar to learn English." So you see the beginnings of teaching that we don't need to learn Latin to learn English. We ought to be learning English grammar. This was just at the beginning of that movement. And yet, even today, there are people who studied Latin grammar in school and say that really was the source of their ability to understand English grammar. The debate continues today. Then we have Thomas Dilworth. Now, this Dilworth did one of the most popular school texts of the entire period. It went through dozens of editions. It was called A New Guide to the English Tongue. It was first published about 1740, although no first edition is known to exist. It was the first English language book to combine a speller and a grammar and a reader. That's a formula that was copied by Buchanan later and even Noah Webster, as well as Lindley Murray. Dilworth listed 200 potentially confusing homophones, such as board, a plank, board, made a hole, B-O-R''D. So it was kind of a usage book. He's remembered for his namesake ghost, who boisterously accused Noah Webster of plagiarism. We're into the 1750s now, And this becomes a very important decade in several respects. For one thing, Samuel Johnson's great dictionary of 1755 appears, but we get ahead of ourselves. Let's back up to James Buchanan, 1753. By the way, Johnson's dictionary had been announced as early as 1747. So people were expecting Johnson's dictionary to come out, and by now it had become conventional to have a grammar at the beginning of a dictionary. This first book from 1753 is James Buchanan, not the President James Buchanan, but the little-known grammarian. We know next to nothing about his life. He was a Scotsman by birth. He did become a schoolmaster in Surrey and a prolific author of educational books and dictionaries. He wrote not only the book displayed here, but also a regular English syntax, 1767, and the British grammar, 1784, both of which were also printed in the United States. In this book, The Complete English Scholar, Buchanan wrote that a wrong education of children is an evil that starves posterity. And remember, he copied Dilworth's habit of having a speller, a reader, and a grammar all in one. Next, we come to Daniel Farrow, the following year, 1754. This book, called The Royal Universal British Grammar and Vocabulary, by a London schoolmaster engaged in puffery that was awed even by the 18th century standards. Quote, "This grammar contains a method so easy that every female teacher in the British dominions may open an English grammar school and render themselves much more useful to the public," end quote. Farrow claimed that with this book, the English language had been, quote, "reduced to a standard, its copiousness manifested." He overestimated himself. Now we're going to go and look at Johnson's dictionary, 1755. Samuel Johnson's dictionary was not the first dictionary of the English language. I mean, we've already seen some other dictionaries, but it was the first authoritative dictionary of the English language. And it was an age in which there was this yearning for authority. Johnson is one of the two most illustrious writers ever to write an English grammar, the other being the playwright Ben Jonson, whose English grammar appeared posthumously in 1640. Johnson's short grammar, essentially the translation of a 1653 grammar written in Latin, an English grammar written in Latin, was the last piece prepared for the 1755 dictionary. Johnson followed the common grammarians and disparaged innovators whose new terms have sunk their learning into neglect. But I will tell you, Johnson's grammar is commonly thought of as the weakest performance in his great big 2-volume folio dictionary. Even before Johnson's dictionary, a man named Benjamin Martin, a great polymath, who's primarily known today as an optician and a scientist, had tried to get into lexicography and to grammar. Benjamin Martin. So he was actually the first lexicographer to number the senses in a dictionary, 1, 2, 3, 4, counting the meanings that each common word might have. He got that idea from Johnson's plan of a dictionary or proposal for a dictionary. In any event, Martin came out with his dictionary in 1749 and then another version in 1754. This is a slightly different book, excerpted from his dictionary. It is his introduction to the English language and learning. He was, as I say, a prodigious intellect with a remarkable versatility. His New English Dictionary was among the better pre-Johnson efforts at English lexicography. As for this book, Martin says that nothing has been so much wanted in our English schools as an introduction to the English language and learning, since common experience but too much evinces how little our youth understand of either. Now we come to one of the most interesting figures in the study of the English language, Anne Fisher, who was the first female grammarian of modern English. Remember, Elizabeth Elstob did Old English. Anne Fisher wrote both a grammar and a dictionary of the English language. She's the first female lexicographer and the first female grammarian of modern English. Interestingly, she was a perfectionist. She had a very rigorous mind, and she was very critical of some other writers. And she seems to have been so critical that she may have had her husband, her printer, Thomas Slack, destroy the early imperfect editions of her book. Because guess what? There are no known copies of the first edition of her dictionary and no known copies of the first couple of editions of her grammar. So we're left with later copies. This is a 7th edition of her practical new grammar with exercises of bad English. Born in Cumberland, Fisher became a business partner with her husband, the printer Thomas Slack, who founded the Newcastle Chronicle. A mother of 9, she wrote many pedagogical works. This grammar is in the form of a catechism, a long series of questions and answers. She's remembered chiefly as the grammarian who first stated the rule that still sparks controversy, that the masculine pronoun supposedly includes the feminine. Then we come to James Hermes Harris. That is his nickname, Hermes Harris. The name of his book is Hermes, or A Philosophical Inquiry Concerning Universal Grammar. We're looking at the 2nd edition of 1765. You can understand Samuel Johnson's evaluation of Harris as a prig and a bad prig. His self-praise was undisguised. He thought that with this book he had done a service to mankind. If the book sold well, Harris said that he would find it no unpleasing event, and his chauvinism was worse than priggish. Quote, "The supreme being is in all languages masculine, inasmuch as the masculine sex is the superior and the more excellent," end quote. James Harris is deservedly forgotten for the most part. Then we come to John Baskerville. John Baskerville was a printer and printed this grammar and dictionary. It's a vocabulary. It's also a usage book toward the end. He is best known as the founder of the Baskerville typeface. We don't actually know that he wrote this book, but he's commonly credited with it, and he was the printer. Baskerville was acquainted with Benjamin Franklin, who consoled him after he experienced the unpleasant biases of London printers against provincial ones. He, after all, was up in Birmingham. Appearing at a time when Baskerville had mostly withdrawn from printing, this grammar is sometimes considered an anonymous work. It is usefully supplemented with a 15-page guide to the most usual mistakes occasioned by, quote, inattention to the rules of grammar. In this case, we come to 2 interesting grammarians, William Ward and Robert Louth. Louth is a major figure, but first let's talk about William Ward. He was a Yorkshire schoolmaster. This is his smaller book, 1767, A Grammar of the English Language in 2 treatises, that was issued by the famous York printer Anne Ward, an unrelated woman who is best known as the initial printer in 1760 of Lawrence Sterne's typographically challenging Tristram Shandy. And then we come to Robert Louth. Here's a big portrait of Louth. There's another portrait of Louth in the corner here. This is his short introduction to English grammar, first printed in 1762. The earliest one I have is 1767. Apart from Lindley Murray, Louth was the most influential grammarian of the 18th century. His work was widely pirated, pilfered, and plagiarized, in the words of Ingrid Tieken-Boon van Ostade. He is often misunderstood as having been archly prescriptive, when in fact he was aware of the different registers in language and understood the structure of English as well as anyone in his day. We also have, next to the portrait, an original letter by Louth. This extraordinary letter appears to date from 1762 and to involve the first edition of Louth's grammar. Louth asked Robert Dodsley, the noted publisher, to prepare copies for Sir Charles Mordaunt, a Tory MP, Lord Sandys, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and various other grandees. One of them was John Hawkesworth, founder of the periodical The Adventurer, but he wanted copies of his grammar sent to them. In this case, we're getting into the 1760s. We have some high points, beginning with Joseph Priestley, who became a grammarian in the early 1760s. Here we're seeing the 1768 second edition of his dictionary. Of course, he's primarily known as a scientist. He was the scientist credited with discovering oxygen, and he was the greatest 18th century intellect to give intense study to grammar. He rebelled against English grammarians being too heavily influenced by Latin, and he was among the earliest English language grammarians to embrace the idea that universal usage governs propriety. He may have been the first to defend "he is taller than me," treating than as a preposition, over the more orthodox "he is taller than I," treating than as a conjunction. Then we come to William Kenrick, quite a character, Kenrick. He was a flamethrower, we might say. This rhetorical grammar of the English language appeared at the beginning of his new Dictionary of the English Language, which was pretty much a knockoff of Samuel Johnson. Kenrick was the son of a corset maker. He was a Grub Street writer who was rarely without a public enemy. Writing always with a bottle of brandy at his side, he thought that he could complete even the most challenging literary tasks in no more than 2 days. Kenrick repeatedly tried to manufacture controversy where there was none, launching scurrilous attacks against Samuel Johnson, David Garrick, the actor, Oliver Goldsmith, the playwright. They mostly ignored him. His dictionary, as I say, was largely lifted from Johnson's. And then we come to the first grammar done by Noah Webster. Noah Webster aspired to be a grammarian long before he aspired to be a lexicographer, long before he was known as the father of the American dictionary. Here we see the 1784 volume 2 of his Grammatical Institute. He was following Dilworth, doing a speller, first of all, 1783, a grammar, 1784, and a reader, 1785. They were all three known as part of a Grammatical Institute, volumes 1, 2, and 3. And Webster, at this point in his career, was trying to be a schoolmaster. He was a failed schoolmaster, as it happened, as well as, you could say, a failed lawyer, and ultimately a failed publisher as well. But he succeeded in lexicography, and that is for what he's best known for. Webster came of age during the American Revolution, attended Yale, and then tried without success to establish a career as a lawyer and schoolmaster. He wrote this book shortly after graduating and was soon accused by the pseudonymous Dilworth's Ghost as transcribing others' work in a laughable affair. His written defense against literary theft at this point was that, quote, "every grammarian whose works I have seen is liable to the charge of plagiarism," end quote. One of the more fascinating parts of this Taming the Tongue exhibit has to do with Noah Webster and Lindley Murray and the connection between them. And we know that Lindley Murray became known as the father of English grammar. We also know that Noah Webster was desperately trying to become the most successful grammarian in America. Lindley Murray was an American who had become an expatriate, an expat in York, England. So after the Revolutionary War, he went to York to live, and he sort of opposed the war, it is thought. But interestingly, back in New York, in 1794, his brother um, leased space, was actually a lease to purchase contract with Noah Webster, none other than Noah Webster, in southern Manhattan. And this is the actual lease between the two men. It was signed by John Murray on behalf of Noah. It marks a turning point in literary history, this document. Lindley Murray, the American expat, agreed through agents to sell land in downtown New York City to Noah Webster. In the 6 months following, Murray wrote the book that would earn him the moniker the father of English grammar, ultimately selling 15.5 million copies of his literacy books. Eclipsed in grammar, Webster soon turned primarily to lexicography. Biographers have never been aware of this link between the men. Never before has this document been displayed with an understanding of its significance. Whether he got the idea in December 1794 to do a grammar, it's a very interesting question, because he had published it as early as the following summer. So could he have gotten the idea from his brother, the fact that he was leasing to a grammarian in December 1794, and put together his dictionary in the next 6 months? I think it is conceivable, but it is certainly an extraordinary connection between the men. Here we have Murray's English Grammar, second edition, 1796. Murray was an American Quaker. He was a lawyer, very successful New York lawyer. In his retirement in England, he wrote 2 books on religion, and then 6 months after contracting to sell that New York real estate to Noah Webster, this grammar. With it, he became one of the best-selling authors of the 19th century and the lifelong foe of Noah Webster. About the time that Noah Webster was first getting interested in language, there was a man named John Horne Tooke who wrote a book called Diversions of Turley. It was a book that would amount to a major setback to linguistic studies. Meaning winged words, Epiatorenta, or the Diversions of Turley, suggests its fancifully obscure style. Tooke was a radical reformer in politics, law, and philology. In the 1770s, he was imprisoned for criminal libel. In 1794, in a notorious trial, he was acquitted of high treason. With quirky linguistic theories, he insisted, for example, that if is really a verb equivalent to give. By the way, he convinced Noah Webster of that. The only essential words, he thought, are nouns and verbs, all other words being abbreviations. In other words, he thought there were 3 parts of speech. Historical linguists today say that his influence stultified linguistic learning for many decades. The Webster-Murray tiff continues. Webster came out with his compendious dictionary in 1806. The following year, he came out with a more ambitious grammar. It's called A Philosophical and Practical Grammar of the English Language, 1807, published in his hometown of New Haven. In 1803, Lindley Murray wrote to Noah Webster, sending an updated version of Murray's grammar. For many years, Webster quoted this letter to Murray's disadvantage. Rather than answer the letter directly, Webster wrote this philosophical grammar, a book hopelessly unsuited to classrooms because of its long digressions about far-fetched etymologies. In the book, Webster claimed to understand the symmetry of the whole edifice of the English language. Just before releasing the book, Webster engaged in anti-Murray campaigns in the newspapers. Then we come to Jane Gardner, who held a school in England. She was the daughter of the scientist John Arden, and she grew up with Mary Wollstonecraft, a founding feminist philosopher. As teenagers, the girls had a tempestuous friendship, as their surviving letters show. Gardner became the headmistress of schools in Yorkshire and in Lincolnshire. She modeled her English grammar on French instead of Latin, because all girls' schools taught French. Copies of her books were used as student prizes. This one, as noted probably in Gardner's own hand, was a prize for improved reading. It was published in 1809. In this case, we have three fascinating grammarians: William Lenny, Noah Webster once again, and William Cobbett. William Lenny's book is called The Principles of English Grammar, 1810. Lenny was a staunchly Latinate grammarian who thought English should be subjugated to Latin. In the preface, he called his little book superior to any other book of the kind. It is intended only for teachers whose, quote, minds are ever on the stretch, and not for those who bid defiance to the fetters of form. Many parents in the lower ranks grudge to pay for books for their children, end quote. These wrong-headed parents believed that pennies were well saved if, quote, fraudulently withheld from the teacher, end quote. Somehow, though, Lenny was a beloved teacher. Then we come to Noah Webster. This is the Rudiments of English Grammar, 1811. Improbably enough, this school book abridgment of Webster's 1807 philosophical grammar contains the most direct attacks on Lindley Murray. Webster urged teachers, or perhaps children, to compare the two grammarians' work to detect the plagiarisms. Short extracts from Webster's 1807 grammar had been dispersed in various parts of Murray's work, according to Webster. Murray seems to have been unaware of these allegations until many years later, when he directed his brother John that no reply should be made. Quote, "Whoever writes a grammar," Murray said privately, "must in some degree make use of his predecessor's labors." Amazingly close to what Webster himself was saying in 1785 when he was accused of plagiarism. And then we come to William Cobbett. It's called A Grammar of the English Language, 1818. He wrote this in New York. Best known as an incendiary English journalist, Cobbett spent much of his life under the threat of prosecution and imprisonment. Twice he fled to America for a period of years. On the second sojourn, living on Long Island and penning this grammar, free from all abstruseness, as he put it. The first two editions were dedicated to William Benbow, a compatriot who had helped Cobbett exhume the bones of Thomas Paine and take them to England, for which Cobbett was ingloriously nicknamed Bone Grubber. Now we're into the 1820s, and two fascinating grammarians that I'll talk about in this case, James Brown and Samuel Kirkham. James Brown, not the popular singer, of course. He was writing in the 1820s. He was an outrageous figure. He's the one who came up with the idea that there were 33 parts of speech. The first edition of his American grammar appeared in 1820. He had opened an American Grammar Academy in Philadelphia and had written a series of grammars that differed much from all others, as he said, and it was true, to say the least. In this one, he posited 33 distinct parts of speech. By 1836, he had retreated to 6 and become a madcap neologist, writing like this. You're not going to believe these words. Quote, "When there is no nepoclide understood, the nepocorn with which the poeclade does not nomify gives a new mono," end quote. The whole book read that way. And then we come to Abraham Lincoln's favorite grammarian, Samuel Kirkham. This English grammar first appeared in the 1820s. Kirkham is known to have inspired Lincoln, who as a teenager walked miles to get a copy of the grammar and then memorized it. By 1829, the book was selling 22,000 copies annually. The big fold-out was a major innovation. An aficionado of phrenology, that is, analyzing the skull to see character, Kirkham left his skull to his wife, then to his son, and then to a phrenological society. His very strange obituary began, quote, "His head was 21 inches around, but was more high and long than large at the base, end quote. The loving remembrance in this journal of phrenology goes on to say that Kirkham was among, quote, the most irritable and fretful of men, end quote. We're still in the 1820s in this case. Three interesting lexicographers, Gould Brown, John Sherman, who was mainly a preacher, and Rufus Nutting, who was a teacher. But let's first of all take Gould Brown, who was the most important of these figures as a grammarian. He taught in various academies over the years, came to be known as the grammarian's grammarian. He did more than anyone else to cement in the popular mind the inaccurate idea that grammar involves inviolable rules. Although his later work would level invective at competitors, in this early book, it's free of any invective. A small treatise on grammar, he wrote, like a small map of the world, may serve to give the learner a correct idea of the more prominent features of the subject. And here we see a portrait of Gould Brown. John Sherman was certainly a fascinating character. He was the grandson of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. John Sherman's was called The Philosophy of Language Illustrated, an entirely new system of grammar, published in 1826. Sherman wrote the most inflamed English grammar in history. The subtitle of the book, one reviewer wrote, has a fearfully belligerent aspect and hurls defiance into the teeth of the enemy. A cultish Unitarian minister who had been expelled from the church, Sherman claimed to deserve well of his country for liberating grammar from the encumbrance of long-received errors. He aimed his book not at, quote, that stupid, bigoted class of prejudiced men, but at the truly learned, end quote. Then we come to Rufus Nutting, whose book was called A Practical Grammar of the English Language. This is the third edition of 1826. After graduating from Dartmouth in 1817, Nutting began teaching at a female seminary in Catskill, New York, and soon married one of his pupils. They moved to Ohio and later to Michigan, where he insistently taught pupils that the passive voice doesn't exist in English. Teachers who thought otherwise were causing a horrific aggregate of injury, he said, because children thereby had lodged in their minds, quote, a disgust which extends perhaps not only to English, but to every other language, end quote. All quite mystifying. There was a tendency in the 1830s for grammarians to become more and more dogmatic. We begin with William Cramp, with his philosophy of language containing practical rules for acquiring knowledge of English grammar, 1838. An inveterate classicist, Cramp spent much of his life erroneously advancing the idea that Philip Stanhope, the fourth Lord Chesterfield, was the 18th century letter-writing author who, under the pseudonym Junius, attacked George III. His friends could scarcely get him to talk about anything else for more than 2 minutes. As for grammar, Cramp thought that it would be difficult, quote, to name a science more extensive in its application or more generally useful, not popular at dinner parties. Then we come to William Stephen Balch. His book is called Lectures on Grammar as particularly connected with English grammar, same year, 1838. Balch was a Universalist minister, and he thought that grammar to be the subject deserving of the first attention of every philanthropist, as he put it. In these transcribed lectures, Balch shows himself to be dogmatically reductionist on many points. Quote, most of the words long considered difficult, he assured listeners, may be easily explained. What about interjections? They, in his words, deserve no attention because they form no part of the language. Any questions? Here's what he said, quote, I cannot believe there is a person present who does not fully comprehend my meaning and discover the correctness of the ground I have assumed. That's typical of the tone throughout. Then we come once again to the ever-combative Noah Webster, who, toward the end of his life, is going further and further off the rails. Webster was a horrible businessman, and he started engaging in various tirades, which were taken down and published. This is called Observations on Language and on the Errors of Class Books. In this rambling speech before the New York Lyceum, which teems with crank-like assertions of error in all the leading books, Webster asserted that most of our grammars tell us that there are 6 tenses in English. But he announces that if there are any tenses at all, there are 12. He didn't say what they were. Our educational system, he said, created smatterers, knowing a little of every branch of study, but acquainted with none. These mistakes demand correction. We're now into the 1840s, and really in the final decade of the period covered here. We begin with Jane Haldeman Marcet. Her little book is called Mary's Grammar, interspersed with stories intended for the use of children. This is a 4th edition. Marcet was a popular writer of introductory books on science. She and her husband, the physicist Alexander John Gaspard Marcet, a political exile from Switzerland, maintained a busy literary salon at their house until his premature death in 1822. She then lived with her daughter in Piccadilly and probably wrote this book for her grandchildren. Quote, "I have so often pitied children who have been studying grammar, which they did not understand. Yet if she herself had understood the metaphysical difficulties involved in writing it, she says she would never have undertaken the task." Once again, we come to Noah Webster. In the last year of his life, 1842, he published an improved English grammar. Now, by now, Webster was well known as a lexicographer. His big magnum opus had appeared in 1828. But toward the end of his life, he was getting ever more cantankerous, and he issued this book called An Improved Grammar of the English Language. 58 years after his first English grammar had appeared, and just a year before his death, the elderly Noah Webster issued this newly improved grammar. Although Lindley Murray had been dead for 16 years, Webster was still plagued by Murray's popularity. All the British grammars were, in his words, very imperfect and very erroneous. He contradicted Murray whenever he could. The contrary rule in Murray is egregiously wrong, he would say, and he persisted in his oddball views. Quote, "Grammars tell us that the word that is sometimes a conjunction. That is not true. It is always a pronoun." He was in a minority in taking these positions. And by the way, Murray was consistently outselling him because Murray wrote better. Murray was better organized. It was very systematic. Webster was very rambling and very disorganized. Then we come to Alfred Croquill, the pictorial grammar. Alfred Henry Forrester wrote under the pseudonym Alfred Croquill. In the year of this book's publication, his cartoons began appearing in Punch. According to one memoir, Croquill was a universal favorite who set many a table in a roar with his medley of songs. He could write, he could draw, and he was an admirable vocalist. This grammar is most notable for its many clever illustrations, including his anthropomorphic conception of verb conjugations. And finally, for this case, Noble Butler. This book was published in Louisville, Kentucky in 1846. It's called A Practical Grammar of the English Language. Butler, a professor in Louisville, wrote the most famous Confederate grammar. His life was transformed in 1853 when his brother William, a Louisville teacher, was murdered in the classroom by the brothers of a student whom William had disciplined the day before. After an infamous verdict acquitting the boys, Butler quelled riots by urging citizens to stay the hand of violence and act calmly. Butler's will instructed that his body should be encased in wood so that it might soon become part of the soil and quickly serve to nurture the beautiful flowers he loved so well. If some of these books that we've been looking at have been unconsciously funny for various reasons, here's one that's purposely funny. It's called The Comic English Grammar by Percival Lee, 1840. The book was illustrated by John Leach. Lee, a Scottish surgeon, relinquished his medical practice to become a comic writer. One of the original staffers at Punch magazine, he also wrote the comic Latin grammar. He liked similes. Quote, "We would have every preface as short as an orator's cough, to which in purpose it is so nearly like," end quote. Some of the humor still works. He says that although a pronoun, quote, "is a word used instead of a noun, we did not mean to call such words as thingamabob, what's his name, what do you call it, and the like pronouns." Percival Lee. And finally, we reach the culmination. This is 1711 to 1851. Part of the reason it culminates in 1851 is this enormous book, The Grammar of English Grammars by Gould Brown. Now, we already saw Gould Brown's first grammar, a slight book. This is his very large, really, you can see why it's called A Grammar of English Grammars. It's discussing what all the grammarians to date have said. It was published, as I say, in New York in 1851. It was a gargantuan book, labeled a 10th edition, even in its first edition. It was Brown's attempt at a complete grammar of the English language. He disclaimed vainglory but embraced invective, referring freely to the scandalous errors and defects which abound in all our common grammars. His competitors were miserably defective, he said, and worthy of censure. Hence, Brown produced this condensed mass of special criticism, such as is not elsewhere to be found in any language, his words. One recent scholar called it a beacon that led to no port, an anachronism that was obsolete before it was finished. Gould Brown. Can you believe how crazed people were about English grammar in the 18th and 19th centuries? We moderns might think it bewildering. The most useful of all sciences, it was called, the primary concern of all philanthropists, the most pertinent knowledge that anybody could have. That was another very different world in which grammar was inculcated into children throughout their education. It's hard to imagine how that world evolved into our own. We've gained things in that evolution, no doubt, but it's worth considering what we might have lost. Thank you for joining me for this walking tour of this exhibition, Taming the Tongue. It's been a pleasure taking you through it, and I want to thank Southern Methodist University, the DeGolyer Library, and its director and chief librarian, Russell Martin III, for mounting this beautifully done exhibition. Thank you.